Well, Mr Dutton, thanks for your time. Let's start with this attack on the Melbourne synagogue and the suggestion by Benjamin Netanyahu the Labor government is anti-Semitic and has effectively encouraged this attack. What do you make of that?
Well, Andrew, it's a tragedy and it's a national disgrace. It should never have happened, and nobody should be surprised by the fact that it has happened, which is part of the tragedy. The fact is that the Prime Minister took a deliberate decision 13 months ago to play down the level of anti-Semitism in the community, and the government's policies right up to this very day have made it less safe for people of Jewish faith in our country. This is an act of terrorism, pure and simple, and I think the Prime Minister's deliberate decision to seek political advantage over the course of the last 12 months on this issue and play to a domestic audience of Green voters, I think has been deplorable and one of the worst things I've ever seen in public life.
So he would say, I condemned the Opera House protests, called for them not to go ahead. I said Israel had a right to defend itself. I've condemned every act of anti-Semitism. As a former Home Affairs Minister, what more could the government be doing to protect the Jewish community in Australia right now?
Well, Andrew, you summed the Prime Minister up very well. He said, but he never does, and that's the problem. And that's what's given rise to what we've seen now. The campuses and the activity that we've seen on our university campuses over the last period was deplorable. It went on for months and months. There were no red lines. Attacks on MP offices, cars being attacked, people locking themselves inside synagogues, etc. It just has no place in our country whatsoever. And the Prime Minister set the tone on October 9 last year when, as you say, on the steps of the Opera House, there were deplorable scenes, and it should have been sent, a very clear message should have been sent at that point that we have zero tolerance for racism and anti-Semitism in our country. And I just think these protesters have taken sucker from the Labor Party approach and the tolerance that the Prime Minister and Minister Burke and others have demonstrated. And I think it's left a whole segment of our community living in fear at the moment, which was unnecessary, and the leadership should have been demonstrated from day one, but it wasn't.
How would you react differently now, though? You were Home Affairs Minister, let's say you're Prime Minister, it's possible in a few months' time. What would you be doing at the moment? I mean, if you don't know who the perpetrators are of this attack, for example, what can you actually do that they're not doing?
Well, Andrew, the Prime Minister won't even use the word terrorist attack, and that says something in itself. I wrote to the Prime Minister suggesting that he should, and this is months ago, that he should convene a national cabinet meeting and bring together the premiers and make it very clear in that meeting and publicly afterwards that we have zero tolerance for anti-Semitism, and that he had instructed the Director General of ASIO and the Australian Federal Police Commissioner to use every element available to them to quash the neo-Nazis, the people who are marching in the streets with hatred in their hearts and in their words. And I think that would have sent a very clear message, and the Prime Minister hasn't done that. He says different things to different sides of the street, and that's why we've got ourselves in the position we have today. It wouldn't have happened under Bob Hawke or John Howard. It wouldn't have even happened under Kevin Rudd or Julia Gillard. And I think some of the Labor premiers are trying to distance themselves from the Prime Minister at the moment, because the position that he's taken here is for crass domestic political opportunity and advantage, and he's created an environment where our country is less safe.
And you're talking perhaps about Chris Minn's suggestion he may ban protests outside places of worship?
Well, yes, I think that's right. And I think Premier Malinauskas and others are really deeply shocked, to be honest, by what they're seeing out of this Prime Minister on a number of fronts. The country at the moment is divided, and the leadership that we expect from our national leader is just not evident in the day-to-day deliberations of the government. And it's no more evident than in what we're seeing, or what we've seen on our university campuses, and it's obviously culminated, predictably, in this very vicious attack where lives could have been lost. A place of worship is sacrosanct, and it doesn't matter whether it's a church or a synagogue or a mosque or a temple. People should be able to practice their religious belief with freedom and with tolerance, and that has not happened, and it's unforgivable, and I think that's why there's a lot of angst and anger, frankly, at the Prime Minister right now.
You met Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. Have you had any contact with him in the past few weeks or months, even the last week?
I haven't spoken to him since our meeting in Israel, but it was very clear when we were in Israel, I think as we discussed at the time, but there is a bewilderment, if you like. I recall very clearly when I was Home Affairs Minister and when I was Defence Minister that we received intelligence from Israel, the only democracy in the Middle East, which saved the lives of Australian defence personnel and thwarted a terrorist attack here in our own country. So that we would treat an ally, a trusted ally of long standing in this way is completely inconceivable. It's tarnished our international reputation. And frankly, Penny Wong should be ashamed of her conduct, and the Prime Minister should exert at least some sign of leadership and rein her in, because at the moment the Labor Party is being dragged so far to the left, they're unrecognisable to many Labor voters across the country.
Well, in that case, given the arrest warrants in the International Criminal Court for Benjamin Netanyahu, are you proposing, if elected, to withdraw Australia from the International Criminal Court?
Well, if I'm fortunate enough to be elected Prime Minister next year, then I would act in our country's best interests. And not only would I contemplate this matter in weighing up the decision that you're talking about, I would also make sure that we have a court which has integrity, because our own soldiers are subject to the vagaries of that court. So I think it is worth contemplating, and I think we should be very clear about that position. Our position in relation to the ICC and other international bodies should be dictated to by what's in our country's best interests and in the best interests of our allies. And using a court for political purposes is not in our best interest. It's not in the best interests of peace in the Middle East, and I think people should reflect on that.
Are you 100% happy with everything the Israeli military and government has done in Gaza, and do you believe in a two-state solution?
Well, Andrew, I can't comment on that from afar, and I don't have the security briefings that are available to the Prime Minister, obviously. So do I want to see peace? Absolutely. Is it horrific to see women and children, regardless of where they live or their religion or their allegiances? I want to see people live safely, and it's horrific to see anybody killed. But as we know, with terrorist organisations, as we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, terrorist organisations have no regard for human life. In the case of Hezbollah and Hamas, they're proxies of Iran, which is a country that's dedicated itself to the destruction of the Jewish people. And it shouldn't surprise us that they have caches of weapons and munitions stored under schools and under hospitals, because they have scant regard for Israelis, let alone, frankly, even Palestinians. And I think when you have an incident as occurred on the 7th of October, bearing in mind that 100 people are still held in captive by those terrorists, when you see the barbaric actions, well, Israel, like Australia, like the UK or Canada or the United States, would react and respond very forcefully to it. I mean, it's inconceivable that Australians would tolerate 100 Australians 13 months old still being held in a tunnel network, and those people not being returned to their loved ones, and that the Australian government wouldn't be doing anything about it. The expectation, rightly, of every Australian would be that we would be doing everything within our means to bring those people home, and that's obviously what the Israeli government is doing as well.
And briefly, a two-state solution, do you believe in that?
Well, our position has been very clear for a long period of time, and the departure of the Labor Party from that bipartisan position is quite remarkable. We're not going to provide support and encouragement to a terrorist organisation. There is a place for a two-state solution, of course, but it's not a discussion that should be taking place when 100 people, including women, who are being sexually brutalised, are being held by a shocking listed terrorist organisation in our own country in a tunnel network in the Gaza region. That's just a statement of common sense, and the fact that the Prime Minister has departed from that and away from our key ally in the United States, I think shows how far off the rails this government is.
Turning now to your nuclear policy, you've suggested you'll release the costings and other details this week. Is the cost of the nuclear plants more than the $642 billion plus you've suggested renewable energy will cost? And what do you make of the government criticism this will only power 4% of the grid? Does your modelling show otherwise?
Well, Andrew, as you say, we'll release the costings, and this has been a very deliberate process in terms of putting out our policy in part so that people can consume it, understand what it is we're proposing. When the Labor Party signed up to AUKUS, they did so knowing that nuclear was a safe technology in its modern form. They did so knowing that they had an obligation to the US and the UK to dispose of the waste in the reactors, and they knew that they could do that safely. The fact is that we have a dreadful situation at the moment where we're deindustrialising. The damage that the Labor Party is doing to the Australian economy is staggering, and particularly through their energy policy. Manufacturers are fleeing our shores. We're going to lose jobs and economic activity, and capital is being taken from our country and going to other parts of the world by global boards who just don't want to invest under this government. So it is important for us to have an energy system which is reliable so that we can keep the lights on. We want energy at an affordable price, not just for families, but for farmers and manufacturers, because that's part of the reason that we're seeing food inflation at the moment as well. And the government's renewables only policy, which is creating the uncertainty and the extra cost that people are paying in their electricity and gas bills, is not going to cost $122 billion, as the Prime Minister keeps saying. But as Frontier Economics points out, it's going to cost well over $600 billion, and that's a conservative estimate. So I think we can deal with the remaining issue, which is time. We're saying 2035 to 2037 before the first reactors can be installed. And don't forget that 19 of the top 20 economies in the world have nuclear power or have signed up to it. Australia's the only one that hasn't. The time issue can be dealt with if there's a bipartisan position, which I think can be achieved post Anthony Albanese's leadership.
Will it be only 4% of the grid?
No, and there's more that we'll have to say in relation to cost and the way in which we can utilise the existing distribution network by ramping up the energy that we're producing out of our 7 coal-fired power stations with the latest generation nuclear technology. And that's a sensible way to do it, because part of the government's policy is to roll out 28,000 kilometres of new poles and wires, which frankly will never happen. And the government's living this lie at the moment. And unfortunately, we're seeing a threefold increase in manufacturing closures.
It'll be hundreds of billions though, won't it, when you announce it this week?
Well, Andrew, we'll release the costings this week, but it's been done by Frontier Economics, which is the most credible economic modeller in the country when it comes to energy policy. They're employed by Labor governments across the country, and interestingly, the work that they did, which demonstrated that the cost of the renewables only policy wasn't 122, it was well over 600, has not been criticised, nor has the government picked apart the assumptions that have been drawn by, or the conclusions that have been drawn by Frontier Economics. So we've got a credible policy that we're putting forward, and it will transition our economy into a modern economy where we can compete with our competitor nations and stand proud in the world.
No nuclear power for 10 years though. How are you reducing power bills in the meantime?
Well, we need to bring a significant amount of gas into the system. Coal is going to be in the system for longer than Labor's admitting at the moment. You've got Labor state governments who are signing up extension of life contracts for coal-fired power. And the government, interestingly, won't release its 2035 targets before the election. Now, that will tell you that under Mr Albanese, in a coalition government with the Greens, that power prices are going to continue to go through the roof. We're going to have more reliability problems in the system, and blackouts and brownouts will become a feature of our economy, which is completely and utterly unacceptable. And as I say, Labor is destroying our economy at the moment, and that's why a lot of families are hurting and small businesses are putting off staff.
Why do these have to be federal government owned? Can't you just set up the prospect of a nuclear industry and let the market decide whether it wants to invest?
Well, there's a level of assurance that's given to the public when it's in public ownership as opposed to a private equity firm. I think that is demonstrated through the research, and that's something we should respect. There is an abundance of capital available because, as we know, this week Meta announced in the United States that they're negotiating with nuclear energy providers to supply 4 gig, which is a phenomenal amount of power that they require for their AI and data storage projects. and other companies, Apple and Oracle and others, are engaging in those conversations. They're conversations that we should be having in our country, Andrew. But of course they're not. They're not talking to the Australian government about the literally tens of thousands of jobs that would be created in an industry like that in the Hunter Valley or in the Latrobe Valley or elsewhere. And I think we should be very serious about this, as many other countries, comparable countries are. The case in France, in Paris, the lights didn't stay on during the winter, during the recent Summer Olympics without nuclear energy. Germany doesn't operate without nuclear energy from France and elsewhere. Let's just have a mature conversation, which I think the premiers, frankly, are keen to have, but the Prime Minister's not up. I just don't think he's up to the job, and I think that's being demonstrated to Australians. All
right, after the Stage 3 tax cuts promise, you and some of your frontbenchers talked consistently, including in interviews on this program, about lower, simpler and fairer changes to the tax rate. You seem to have backed away from this. Do you plan to go to the election with an income tax cuts policy or package, a difference from the government's?
Well, Andrew, I've said before that, yes, of course, we want lower, fairer, simpler taxes, but we have to be able to pay for it, and it'll depend on the fiscal position when we get closer to the election. That will be obviously made known to us. We're responsible economic managers, and that's why interest rates are always lower under a coalition government, and it's why we always manage the economy more effectively than the Labor Party. The Labor Party in Victoria is destroying the economy there at the moment.
All right, so that means maybe
we have to do to clean up Labor's mess.
Mr Dutton, well, that means maybe. It's on the table, but it's not confirmed yet from your point of view.
Well, Andrew, we've just got to deal with the reality at the moment. The reality is that people are paying higher rates for their mortgages than they need to because, as the Reserve Bank governors pointed out, the Albanese government's policies have fuelled inflation, which is why interest rates are higher. Interest rates are coming down in the US, in Canada, in New Zealand and in the UK, but they're not here, and they should have by now. And we want to reduce inflation. That will be our objective, so that we can bring interest rates down, and frankly that'll be the best assistance that we can provide to families. But the Labor Party's policies are going to keep inflation and therefore interest rates higher for longer.
You previously talked about a reduction to net migration to just 160,000. Is that still what you want to achieve?
We've spoken about a 25% reduction because the government's bringing in a person every 44 seconds at the moment. 1.67 million people over 5 years.
No, but on net migration,
away from infrastructure.
That's permanent migration. What about net migration?
Our policy is on net migration at the moment. It's an interesting topic you raise because the government has a disaster that's been brewing for the last couple of years. They've got a migration program that's been taking advantage of people at the end of their visas refusing to go from our country. And as we demonstrated when we were in government, we will manage our migration program to our country's benefit. We're a great country in good part because of the migration over many, many years, but we're not going to tolerate a situation where young Australians can't find rental accommodation or have no chance of home ownership. And
but so you're not sticking to the 160,000. You're not sticking to the 160,000 target for net migration then?
Andrew, what we've said is that we want our migration program to step down in the first 2 years. It will ramp up again in years 3 and 4, and we will bring down the numbers who come through the humanitarian and refugee program back to the long-run average of that. That's what will work for our country. Again, we'll have a look at the economic settings, as we said at the time of the policy announcement. We'll have a look at the economic settings when we come into government to determine exactly how much damage Labor has done and what we need to do. On the supply side of housing, we've got a $5 billion project which will fuel 500,000 new homes, and that supply side has not been addressed by the government, and they only compound the problem by increasing the numbers in the migration program as we've seen over the last 2.5 years.
Just finally on IR, what will you go to the election and promise to wind back? Will you wind back the right to disconnect? Will you seek to wind back multi-employer bargaining, same job, same pay? Will you promise to change the definition and treatment of casuals that the government's promised? Will all this be wound back?
Well, Andrew, we'll announce our policy in due course, but as I think we've demonstrated in government before, we're a government that manages the economy effectively. We need to get the balance right between workers' rights, which are incredibly important, but there's no sense having businesses that are closing at a record rate, which is what's happening under the government at the moment for small business, because there are then no jobs for those employees. So we have to have a buoyant economy. We need to have the economic settings in place that can reduce pressure on families, not add to pressure. And we want to attract manufacturing as opposed to drive it offshore, which is what's happening under the government's policies at the moment. So we'll announce all of that in due course.
Peter Dutton, thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you.